the night of April 24th, 1915, in the city of Constantinople, the Ottoman government arrested 235 Armenian intellectuals. They were taken from their homes, mostly after midnight. Police knocked on their doors. The men dressed and came down. Their families were told they would be back in a few days. The list was specific. It had been prepared in advance. Writers, doctors, lawyers, newspaper editors, members of the Ottoman parliament, composers, a high school principal, 3 priests, a pharmacist, the president of the Armenian Medical Association. They were not random. They were the men around whom an Armenian community gathered for guidance in language and law. Their arrest was the opening act of an attempt to remove not just a people, but the people who would have remembered them. Within weeks, most of the 235 were dead. This is the story of how it began, what it became, and why, 110 years later, the country where it happened still does not call it by its name. For most of the 4 centuries before 1915, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire lived under a system the empire called the millet. It was a kind of legal segregation that allowed Christians and Jews to govern their own community affairs, but kept them in a second-class status. Armenians paid extra taxes. They could not testify against Muslims in court. They could not bear arms. In the mountains of eastern Anatolia, where the Armenian population was densest, they lived alongside Kurds and Turks. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling at its edges. The Russians were pressing in from the north. The Balkans had broken off in 1878. The empire's response was a long retreat inward, accompanied by a growing suspicion of any subject population that might be sympathetic to outside powers. The Armenians were the obvious candidate. Many of them looked east toward Russia, where they hoped for protection. In 1894, Sultan Abdul Hamid II began responding to small Armenian protests with massacres. Over the next 3 years, between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were killed across the eastern provinces. The Hamidian massacres, as they came to be called, were the first state-scale slaughter of the Armenian people. They were a rehearsal. In 1908, a constitutional revolution called the Young Turk Movement overthrew Abdul Hamid. For about 3 years, Armenians believed the new government would be different, multi-ethnic, constitutional, equal. It was not. By 1913, the most radical wing of the Young Turks had seized exclusive power. Their vision was an empire purified into a single nation. There was no place for the Armenians in it. When the First World War began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered on the side of Germany. The Russian army moved south through the Caucasus. A small number of Armenian volunteers fought on the Russian side. The Ottoman government took this as confirmation of what they already believed, that the Armenian population, in its entirety, was a fifth column. The decision to remove them was taken at the highest levels of the government in the early months of 1915. The roundup in Constantinople on the night of the 24th was the visible signal that the decision had been made. The names on the list of 235 had been chosen carefully. They were not the most politically active Armenians. They were the most culturally central. The reasoning, according to the orders preserved in the Ottoman archives, was that removing the intellectual class would prevent the surviving Armenian population from organizing resistance, or even from making sense of what was about to happen to them. The 235 were taken to a central police station, held overnight, and then sent in 2 waves, one to the inland city of Ayash, the other to a holding center at Çankırı. From those locations they were dispersed further. A small number, perhaps a dozen, eventually returned. The rest were killed in the months that followed. Among them was the poet Daniel Varujan, 30 years old, one of the most respected Armenian writers of his generation. He was hanged. Among them was Krikor Zorab, a 60-year-old novelist and former member of the Ottoman parliament, who had been close personal friends with the interior minister, Talat Pasha. Zorab had even sought Talat's protection the week before. Talat received him warmly, gave him a cigar, and assured him there was nothing to worry about. Zorab was arrested days later, deported, and beaten to death with a rock by his guards somewhere along the road to Aleppo. Among them was the composer Komitas Vardapet, who survived the deportation physically, but suffered a mental collapse from which he never recovered. He spent the last 20 years of his life in a Paris psychiatric hospital. On May 27, 1915, the Ottoman parliament passed what was called the ez-zor law. It authorized the deportation of any group considered a threat to military security. The text of the law did not mention the Armenians by name. It did not need to. Over the following 6 months, virtually the entire Armenian population of eastern Anatolia was forced from its towns and villages and pushed south on foot, in convoys often hundreds of people long, escorted by soldiers and gendarmes. The destination, according to the official paperwork, was a series of resettlement camps in the Syrian desert. The actual destination for the great majority was death along the way. The convoys moved through the summer of 1915 at a rate of about 6 miles a day. They passed through mountain ranges, across river valleys, and out onto the plains. They were attacked frequently by Kurdish irregular forces who had been informally authorized by the government to take whatever they wanted from the deportees. Many of the deportees died in those attacks. Many more died of starvation, exhaustion, dysentery, and exposure. The very young and the very old died first. Henry Morgenthau Sr., the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, was watching all of this in real time. He cabled Washington frequently in the summer of 1915. The cables he sent are now in the United States National Archives. In one, he wrote, "I have hardly slept for 2 weeks. I have made repeated representations to the Turkish authorities. They tell me that the policy is settled. They will not deviate from it." In another, "It is impossible to convey to you, even with the most graphic descriptions, an adequate impression of what is being done." The final destination of the surviving convoys was a town called Deir ez-zor on the Euphrates River in what is now eastern Syria. By the time they arrived there, in late 1915 and early 1916, they had been walking for months. Many of the women were carrying children who had died in their arms days earlier. Deir ez-zor was not a camp in any organizational sense. It was a field. There were no shelters, no rations, no medical care. The survivors who reached it, a few tens of thousands by most estimates, were systematically killed there in the spring and summer of 1916, in waves at massacre sites along the Kabur River. The total number of Armenians who died in the Ottoman Empire between 1915 and 1923 is estimated by most historians at between 1.2 and 1.5 million. This is roughly the same death toll as the Cambodian Genocide. It happened over an area roughly the size of France. The war Ottoman Empire collapsed. The young Turk leadership, including Talat Pasha, the interior minister who had ordered the deportations, fled to Berlin under assumed names. In 1919, an Ottoman military tribunal back in Constantinople convicted Talat and several other genocide architects in absentia and sentenced them to death. But they were in Germany, and Germany would not extradite them. A small group of Armenian survivors, working in coordination, decided to find them and kill them. The operation was called Operation Nemesis, after the Greek goddess of retribution. There were 9 names on the list. Over the next 4 years, 6 of them were assassinated. The most famous of these was Talat Pasha himself. On March 15, 1921, on a sidewalk in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin, a 24-year-old Armenian student named Sogomon Tilirian walked up behind Talat in broad daylight and shot him in the head. Tilirian made no attempt to escape. He stood over the body until the German police arrived. He told them, in halting German, that he had killed a murderer. Tilirian had lost 90 members of his family in the genocide. He had been left for dead under a pile of corpses outside the city of Erzincan and had crawled out at night, eventually making his way west. His testimony at his trial in Berlin in June 1921 was the first time the deportations had been described in detail in a European court. The jury deliberated for 1 hour. They acquitted him. Watching the Tilirian trial from the public gallery was a 21-year-old Polish-Jewish law student named Raphael Lemkin. He had been following the case obsessively. He kept asking his law professors why there was no international law against the systematic killing of a people. The professors told him there was no such law because such a thing was not really a crime. It was an internal matter for each sovereign government to handle. Lemkin disagreed. He decided he would create the law himself. He spent the next 20 years working on it. He fled Poland in 1939, 2 days before the German invasion, and eventually reached the United States, where he taught at Yale and Duke. In 1944, he published a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. In one chapter, he introduced a new word. He had built it himself out of the Greek root genos, meaning race or people, and the Latin suffix -cide, meaning killing. Genocide. The word, Lemkin wrote, was meant to describe a particular kind of crime, the deliberate destruction of a people, not as a side effect of war, but as a goal in itself. He defined it to cover not only mass killing, but also forced sterilization, the kidnapping of children, the destruction of cultural institutions. Anything aimed at making a people, as a people, cease to exist. Lemkin had been driven to this word in part by the Armenian case. But by the time he published it in 1944, he had a much fresher example. His own family, most of his aunts, uncles, cousins, and his mother, had been killed in the Holocaust. His brother was the only family member he ever saw again. In 1948, with Lemkin lobbying delegations at the United Nations in person, the General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The convention defined the crime almost exactly as Lemkin had defined it 4 years earlier. The Armenian Genocide is the case that drove the word into existence. It is also the case the international system has been least willing to apply the word to. The successor state to the Ottoman Empire is the Republic of Turkey. The Republic was founded in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who had been an Ottoman military officer during the war, but had been on a different front and had no direct involvement in the deportations. From its founding, the Turkish state took the position that no genocide had occurred. There had been intercommunal violence during a difficult wartime period, in which Turkish and Kurdish civilians had also died. The Armenians had been disloyal, sympathetic to Russia. Their relocation south had been a security measure. The deaths along the way were unfortunate, but were the deaths of war. This has remained the official Turkish position for 100 years. In 2005, Turkey added Article 301 to its penal code, criminalizing the act of insulting Turkishness. The article has been used repeatedly to prosecute Turkish citizens, historians, journalists, even Nobel laureate novelists like Orhan Pamuk, for publicly referring to the events of 1915 as a genocide. On January 19, 2007, a Turkish Armenian journalist named Hrant Dink was shot dead in front of his newspaper office in Istanbul. Dink had been editor of Agos, a bilingual Turkish-Armenian weekly. He had been prosecuted 3 times under Article 301. The shooter was a 17-year-old Turkish ultranationalist. At Dink's funeral, more than 100,000 people marched through the streets of Istanbul, holding signs in Turkish that read, "We are all Hrant Dink. We are all Armenian." It was a moment. The Turkish government allowed it to pass and resumed denying. In 2014, on the eve of the centennial, the Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan issued a statement offering condolences to the Armenian descendants of those who had died in 1915. The statement was carefully worded. It used the phrase, "events of 1915." It did not use the word genocide. The Armenian diaspora's response was to call it less an apology than a more polished form of the same denial. As of 2026, the Armenian Genocide is officially recognized by 34 countries, including the United States, which finally recognized it in 2021. France, Germany, Russia, Canada, and most of the European Union. The European Parliament has recognized it. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has unanimously affirmed it. The Vatican has called it the first genocide of the 20th century. Turkey continues to deny it. The Armenian population today, worldwide, is approximately 7 million people. About 3 million live in the small Republic of Armenia, which became independent after the Soviet collapse in 1991. The remaining 4 million live in the global diaspora. They are the descendants of the survivors. Every April 24th in Yerevan, at a monument called Tsitsernakaberd, built into a hill overlooking the city, Armenians gather to commemorate the dead. There is an eternal flame. Around it, on a granite ring, the names of the towns the deportation convoys passed through are carved into the stone. The ceremony involves the reading of names. They begin with the writers. If you know a story that belongs in this archive, leave it in the comments.